How well has the Bank of Japan done? How do they, in your view, see 2018, and how will things evolve?
I think the Bank of Japan did very well in the past several years, easing monetary policy and mainly purchasing of government bonds. However, that inflation target cannot be achieved. The reason is Japanese inflation or deflation is coming from structural problem rather than just depending on monetary policy. In other words, aging population, that inflationary pressure goes down, and also the economic recovery will be delayed. The reason is a structure, and it is not necessarily caused by the changes in monetary policy. That is the biggest problem for Japan.
Yoshino-san, let me bring up this next chart because I think it really illustrates what the Bank of Japan is contending with, and your point about the lack of inflation and therefore the lack of wage growth being a structural issue. And to be fair, near stagnant wages, as you can see on that chart, inflation is still nowhere near target. This is not just something that the Bank of Japan is contending with, but here in Australia, the Fed, a number of other central banks scratching their heads over the same problem. So the question is, does that mean the Bank of Japan's current policy has run its course, because it's not going to be able to force inflation up to 2% anytime soon? Or is it that they can't afford to tighten because exactly of the same point, that we're nowhere near 2% inflation? And also, I suppose we should point out that on the fiscal side, it's not exactly supportive if we're looking at another sales tax hike.
Yes, I think that 2% goal of the inflation will be a long-term target. And I think in the medium term, it may be difficult to achieve because Japan's rate of inflation affected by oil price and food price, lots of external factors, not only by internal factors. That is one. Secondly, when the population is aging, economic impact of monetary policy diminishes, because monetary policy affects the working population whose wage rate will go up and so on. But retired people is outside of those territory of monetary policy. And that is affecting significantly to Japan. Secondly, the banking behavior has been very much suffered by this negative interest rate policy. Japanese local banks, because of aging population, loan demand are diminishing. Then they used to invest into JGB. However, the JGB is negative interest rate. So they started to invest into overseas, and that is another currency risks and so on. So I think that Central Bank of Japan, it is okay to keep the 2% rate of inflation as a long-term goal. But because of various exogenous factors, achievement in the short run and medium run may be difficult. So what we have to do is we have to do so many structural reforms. One is participation in the labor market by females, and also new innovative companies has to be created, and innovations. And also elderly people have been allowed to work much longer and after the retirement, but wage rates to be based on marginal productivity. So I think those are the most important thing for Japan to tackle. And monetary policy has a very limited role. And furthermore, the effectiveness has been gradually diminishing due to aging population.
So in terms of monetary policy and fiscal policy, it seems to me that if I could broadly characterize a lot of the reflationists, one of their arguments is that Japan has to keep a 2% inflation target. It has to reach 2% inflation because if it's ever going to reduce its debt to GDP ratio, it's going to do this by letting inflation gradually rise and then gradually reducing the value of that debt over time, kind of spreading the cost of that over the entire population. Is that your view as well?
No, I don't think 2% rate of inflation is the necessary target. If the economy is grow or lower rate of inflation, I think that income tax and corporate tax revenue goes up. That will have very good impact on the budget deficits. So it is not necessary that the 2% rate of inflation, that is first. And secondly, I think that the monetary policy is now creating huge liquidity into the market. When we look at the asset price bubbles in Japan in late 1980s, we have faced with a similar low rate of inflation, and asset prices started to rise, especially land price went up very high. why we experienced low inflation late 1980s? Because exchange rate has been appreciated, so import price has been dropped. The same thing is happening. Oil price has been started to drop, so we had experienced very stable rate of inflation. And I'm very much concerned about the too much liquidity that may cause another mini bubble in Japan. In other words, banks are accepting deposits. Lots of deposits are coming in because of easy monetary policy. And banks do not have any place to lend money, and also they cannot put their money into JGB. So they are now increasing their housing loans, apartment loans, and so on, and overseas loans. So I think that slightly keeping current monetary policy not so much exacerbated, because that the inflation or low rate of inflation is coming from structure, and it is not mainly because of monetary policy.
So this all begs the question, has it been the BOJ's work which has really been responsible for the recent economic revival in Japan, or has it been the work of Kuroda, of course, Shinzo Abe?
I think that Mr. Kuroda's policy in the past several years was very good, because easing the monetary policy and also changed expectation of inflation. But the biggest hand for Mr. Abe is the structure. It's not the monetary policy. The structure problem has to be resolved. And as I mentioned, aging population is one of the biggest structural problems for Japan. Then innovation has to be created. Then Japan is dominated by banks. Then banks are very much reluctant to make risky loans due to stringent Basel capital requirement. In Western nations, they have venture capital market. But in Japan, venture capital market was not so much grown yet. Then hometown investment trust funds or other ways to channel the new individual money into innovative innovations and new startup businesses, that channel has to also be created. So I think that long-term 2% is fine to keep it, but we should not criticize that 2% was not achieved, because rate of inflation depends on various many factors.
Yoshino-san, should Kuroda stay on? Will he stay on?
I think they buy too much on long-term government bonds. So I think they should reduce the purchasing of long-term government bonds a little bit and make the yield curve much, much more steeper. And that is one important thing. And that will help the financial institutions to invest there. That is one. Secondly, since U.S. has increased its interest rate in December, so slight changes of Japanese monetary policy will not affect capital flows between Japan and U.S. and Europe. So I think that it is better to keep the liquidity a little bit tighter, and then keep the monetary policy as a stance with going on.